Okay, hello boys and girls. This is your video review for your first trimestral exam in history for the second half of it at least. So again, as we did in geography, please do not just watch this video, take notes of this video, pause this video, repeat everything that you don't understand until you're actually able to understand it, okay? So, this second half of the trimester in history, what we are studying are ancient cultures. And if you remember from our previous trimester, well, the previous half of the trimester, what we said is that we are going to be studying history as we would in global history. What does that mean? That means that we are going to be asking problems, that we are going to try to research some topics within history instead of trying to tell everything that happened. What we are going to do is we're going to broach particular problems, particular research questions, and we are going to see them in different cultures of the world. So, uh, well, in this case, the first thing that I want you to know is this very, very brief historical background of the first problem that we are going to be studying this second half of the first trimester. And it is related to the 19th century because the 19th century, and we will see this in the second trimester, by the end of the second trimester, every century has something in particular. They have a special characteristic that sets it apart from other centuries. So, in the case of the 19th century, the main characteristic is that it is going to be, well, in one side, the century in which the colonies in Latin America are going to get their independence. Actually, all America is going to start to get their independence. And also, the 19th century is really particular because it is the century of evolution as a theory. Not only Darwin, and Darwin was a 19th century guy, but a lot of people were trying to explain everything related to their disciplines, to their particular areas of science, using evolution as the main concept of analysis. So, as Darwin was trying to find how we have common ancestors with the monkeys, not that we descend from the monkeys, but that we have common ancestors with the monkeys, there were other guys like Morgan and Taylor, which were trying to find out, or who were trying to find out, how did we get to the point in which we are in history? How did our societies went from being here to being here? And in this case, it is from being here in the stage that they called savagery to being here in the stage that they call civilization. Sorry, I am really, really sorry. So, they're going to be asking themselves this question: how do we get from one point to another? And in here I am adding another example. This is Herbert Spencer, and this is just to tell you that Darwin was not the only guy working in a theory of evolution. Actually, before him there was a guy called Lamarck, which also developed a theory of evolution. But in this case, Spencer is really interesting because he developed a theory of evolution that included the evolution of the universe and the planets, the evolution of the living things, such as what Mr. Darwin is trying to find out, and the evolution of human society. So he was a really complex author. He was studying absolutely everything, right? The evolution of the planets, after that, the evolution of life on Earth, and finally, the evolution of societies within Earth, well, living organism societies. So it was really, really complex. He really was looking at everything, but there are other authors coming from the 19th century that we are going to study later and that are going to be following this same idea. What is that idea? Trying to use this way of explaining that is basically about saying how one thing is transforming throughout history. And the only problem here is that they used to believe that there was only one way to, let's say, to progress in history. That there is only one way to get to civilization, that is after barbarism and that is after savagery. And that is not the case, of course, but back in those days, that was the idea. So, this is where this word civilization comes from. In this attempt from the 19th century to explain how we got to this point, if in the beginning of human history we were all divided in tribes or hordes, and we certainly were not very advanced in our technology or so on. So that was the question in the 19th century. How do I get from here to here, where I have big cities, and to here, where I have a state and, well, modern technology? And that is what this word civilization means. It means that very few societies, mainly the European societies, were able to get to the point in which we can call them civilized people. And all the other societies are just barbaric or savage societies. And well, that is pretty racist, but just look at them. I mean, these were pretty old times. Everybody had a very long beard and felt as if they were Santa Claus, right? So we need to understand that these were other times. Of course, if these guys would have lived in the 21st century, they wouldn't have been as racist as they actually were 200 years ago. But they were. So the thing is that we shouldn't be using this concept anymore. Because every time that we use it, what we are doing is that we are telling other societies that do not share these characteristics, we are saying that they are barbaric or savage societies. And that is just very racist and it is just not true. But even then, there are very different, let's say, criteria that you can take into consideration in order to know if a society got to the point of civilization, or if you want to be very racist and call it a barbaric society. And for example, these are the conditions that Morgan proposed. This guy over here, this one, he is Morgan. And Morgan proposed that in order to call a society a civilization, they require to know how to use iron, not copper, not bronze, not anything else. Iron. Okay, so this is um, like the first material from which you make steel. This is not steel yet, but it is iron. So if you don't know how to use iron, you are not civilized. Second thing, you need to have phonetic alphabets. What is a phonetic alphabet? It is an alphabet that represents sounds. There were other societies that also had writing systems, such as the Egyptians, such as Mexicas here in Mexico, but their alphabets were not quite phonetic. They, for example, here in Mexico, they were ideographic alphabets. That means that instead of representing sounds, they were representing ideas. So, according to Morgan, that is a very, let's say, old or a very ancestral way of writing. That the real way of writing that can make you a civilized society is phonetical writing. That means that your letters stand in the place of sounds, not in the place of ideas. For example, nowadays we have the letter A, and if you write a letter A, you know that you need to read A. And if you see a letter, I don't know, L, you need to read L. And if you find a letter a letter T, you're going to read T. And if you find a U, you're going to read U. And if you find an R, you're going to read And if you find an A, you're going to read A. So that would sound altura, right? So every one of these letters is representing a sound, and if I place them together, they are saying altura. And that is a word. So this way of writing, using letters that stand in the place of sounds, that is one of the characteristics of civilizations for Morgan. And if you don't have one of these alphabets and you still represent whole ideas or you use other way of writing, you are not a civilization. And finally, this is a very nice one. I really enjoyed this one a lot because if you remember, I read you this passage in class in which Morgan, who is a guy that lived 200 years ago. Like 200 years ago, the Mexican independence was happening, right? So this guy that lived 200 years ago, he was writing, the greatest achievement of civilization is the train. And nowadays, 200 years after what Morgan was writing, we do not believe that the highest achievement of humanity and of civilization is a train, right? We have better things, much, much better things. So you can really see here how these concepts are originated in particular historical contexts, and we should not use them outside of those contexts. So we shouldn't use civilization anymore. But this is just one of the proposals of one guy. This is what Morgan would tell you. If you want to call something a civilization, then that society must be able to use iron. They need to have a phonetic alphabet, and well, if they have a train, then they are the highest civilization there is. So basically, they are European, right? But this is the proposal of your book. The proposal of your book in page 49 is going to tell you that in order to call something a civilization, what they need to have are 5 elements. And you have a foldable about this, so please study your foldable. This comes in your exam. And what are those 5 things that a society needs to have in order to be a civilization according to your book? Well, first, specialized workers, record keeping, cities, improved technology, and complex institutions. And the only thing that I want you to know is that this is a proposal, right? Everybody calls civilization something different, and that is actually true. If you compare what Morgan and Taylor are saying, these two guys are saying that a civilization, what is a civilization, they are not going to be agreeing. Like they both agree that we have civilization, barbarism, and savagery, but they don't agree on what is a civilization, what is barbarism, what is savagery. Like everyone has a different opinion. So this thing that your book is telling you, it is a proposal, it is okay, but it is not the only way to understand civilization, okay? I only want you to know that. It is not the only way to understand a civilization. However, using these 5 elements that your book is proposing, what I am doing and what I need you to do in your exam is try to think of another way to understand these societies without calling them civilizations. This means without saying that other societies are barbaric. So, what is my proposal and the thing that I need you to understand in order to write it in your exam? Well, that we can basically replace the notion of civilization if we only understand that we are speaking about societies with 2 things: a particular way of organization and a particular settlement pattern. So, what is that settlement pattern? The city. And what is that way of organization? The state with a capital S. Do not ever forget, state with a capital S has a different meaning. It is not Estado. Well, it is, but Estado with a mayúscula, which has a different meaning. So let's start over here in the city. Why do I say that we can replace this whole idea of civilization if we just think about societies living in cities and organized in states? Well, because first of all, what is a city? And a city is basically a bunch of people living together. A lot of people interconnected, living close to each other, making activities close to each other. That is why coronavirus really spread in the cities, right? Because in the cities, everyone is close together. And in order to avoid the spread of coronavirus, we need to get our social distancing right. Am I right? It's like we need to have some distance. And in cities, we don't. We are a lot of people and no distance at all. So, anyways, if a city is basically a bunch of people living and working together, what is the first thing that you need in order to keep these people living and working together? And of course, it is food. So, where am I going to get the amount of food that I require in order to feed my city? Well, what I need is something called intensive agriculture. So, it is not just agriculture, it is not just getting some corn out of the land. It is intensive. This means we need to get more than more than a few corns out of this. We need to really be able to get a lot of food because we have a lot of people living together. So we need not only very few food, we need a lot of food. So that is why we need intensive agriculture. So that means we need a way to get our agricultural resources as abundant as to be able to feed all of these people. I need to find a way to produce enough food for all of these people. So, what does that imply? Well, if I want to have intensive agriculture, what I require, first of all, are resources. And which resources? Well, basically, water and fertile soil. If I have water and fertile soil, I will be able to get crops, right? That is basically what I need. Some very nice sun, water, and fertile soil, and your plant is going to grow, right? So where these ancient people got these resources? Well, usually out of rivers. Why out of rivers? And in the case of Mesopotamia, they are the Tigris and the Euphrates rivers, right? Well, because rivers, of course, carry water, but they do not only carry water, they also carry silt. And over here, I have a picture for you of what is silt. So it is a kind of mud, it is very similar to clay, and it is made out of mainly mineral materials, but it is, of course, also carrying a lot of organic material in process of decomposition, of decomposing. So, well, yes, it is very, very fertile soil. It is a soil that is going to be carried by the rivers, but it is also really stinky. So you don't want it where you live. You want it where you grow your crops. But you don't want it inside your city because this can cause a lot of diseases. It is basically moth that is rotting over there. So that this means that I need to be able to control these rivers. I need to be able to take the water and the silt to the places where I need them, so that is my cropping fields. And I need to get the water and the silt out of the places where I live. So that means that I need to get the water and the silt out of the city. So this means that I am going to require some technology. I am going to have to build some dams, some canals, to have some tools in order to control the rivers and to have my intensive agriculture that is going to give me all the food that my population requires. So this technology, all these constructions that I need are going to be really important because they are going to be done by people with special knowledge. Specialized workers. Specialized workers are people that have particular knowledge about some things so that they can do some things that other people can't. Like, for example, I do not know how to build a whole car. I wouldn't be able to build a whole car. Only very few specialized workers, workers that, of course, have their jobs in car factories, they know how to assemble a car, but I don't, right? It is a specialized work. Not everybody knows how to do it, only people specialized in it. And well, this is going to be very important. Why? Because all of this intensive agriculture, all of this technology applied to production, technology applied to get crops, it is going to cause something called surplus. And remember that surplus is when I produce more than what I require to live. If I need, in order to live, 5 tomatoes and I grow 7 tomatoes, then those two tomatoes are surplus tomatoes. They are more than what I require in order to live. But that is very important. Why? Because if I have specialized workers, that means that these workers are going to be spending their time in doing their specialized labor, the special thing that only they know how to do and that I don't know how to do. But they won't have enough time to grow their own food. They won't have time to go to the fields and grow their own corn. So they will require the food, and that food is going to come from the surplus. So not everybody is going to be able to grow their own crops. Some people will be really busy doing other things, doing other labors. So those people are going to be fed with the surplus, with all the extra things that were produced with this intensive agriculture. Now, one very, very important thing is that, this surplus needs to be managed. And when we get to the point in which the surplus needs to be managed, we have already entered the state. Remember that we're about to see what is a state to a deeper level. And over here, I only wrote in a very light color that the state, at least its main characteristic, is that it has a monopoly over the legitimate violence. But one of its main functions is going to be to manage the surplus. And the state is going to collect the surplus in the way of taxes, and it is going to distribute that surplus in order to feed people, or if they need to build something, then they are going to use the money or the materials from the surplus to build it, and so on. So this means that I need people specialized in managing, and those people are the bureaucrats. Remember that bureaucracy means that the writings are ruling. That in order to rule, I need writings, I need papers. So the bureaucrats are also another way of specialized workers. They are the specialized workers of the state. So basically, if you pay attention here, just by explaining a city and very few traits of the state, I am able to get all the five elements that your book is stating. For example, I am going to have the cities here. I am going to have the technology here. I am going to have the bureaucrats here, which are people devoted to writing or managing the state. I am going to have specialized workers here. I am going to have four. I am missing one of them. I am missing one of them. Ah, of course, the state. Why the state? Because your book says complex institutions over here. And in the whole world, there is not a single institution that is more complex than the state. So we have specialized workers, sorry about this, we have specialized workers, we have record keeping, we have cities, we have technology, complex institutions, we have everything. So what you need to understand and what you will have to answer in your exam is how we don't need to use the word civilization anymore, because everything that we need to understand is that when they were saying civilization in the 19th century, they were trying to say, oh, they are societies organized in states and living in cities. That doesn't mean that they are superior to other societies. That is what they meant, right? But what they said was they were civilized and other people were barbaric. Yes? So please understand this. What you need to understand, what you need to have really clear is that we don't need to use civilization anymore. What we need to understand is that they are talking about societies living in cities and organized in states. And a bit more about these specialized workers, I just want to talk a bit about this difference between mechanical and organic solidarity. Societies with mechanical solidarity are societies in which everybody does the same thing. This means, for example, here in the picture, you have a community in which everybody is working on the fields. And usually they even do it at the same time. So the only actual divisions that I am going to have in my society are sex and age. So basically, all the boys of the same age are going to be doing the same things, and all the girls of the same age are going to be doing the same thing. But other than your age and your gender and your sex, you are the society is not going to have any more divisions. Now, as opposed to that, what we have is organic solidarity. And we, nowadays, we are a society with organic solidarity. But what is that? Well, organic solidarity comes from the idea of the organism. And an organism is an individual made out of organs. And every organ does a different job, and we need all of those organs in order to be alive. So, in an organic solidarity society, everybody is going to be doing something different. So, that means that everybody requires of the work of everybody else. Because you are not going to be growing your own crops, you're going to be working in something else. So, you need someone to grow your crops for you. For example, here there are doctors, and doctors are not going to be growing their own food. They need somebody to make their food. But while the chef is working, then he won't have time to take pictures. So he needs a photographer in order to have pictures. And while the photographer is taking pictures, he doesn't know how to fly a plane. So if he wants to travel, he needs a pilot, and so on. We all need each other because we all do different things, okay? So precisely this is the case of a state. They all need of each other because they are doing different things. They are specialized workers. Some of them are growing crops, some of them are building dams and canals, some of them are managing the state. So everybody is busy doing something, and everybody needs everybody else's work. So, what is the point here? Well, that Mesopotamia was actually the first state and city of history, the city of Ur. At least it is the earliest state that we have proof of. Perhaps there was a previous state, but we don't have any proofs of that. And well, as you can see, Mesopotamia is in between the rivers Tigris and Euphrates, and it is precisely here in the Middle East. If you see here, we have the Nile River, so this is Egypt, this is Saudi Arabia, and Mesopotamia is just above it, in between Arabia, Saudi, and Iran, and Iraq, right? So here you have some examples. This is King Gilgamesh, and this is the city of Ur. So he was the king, and he was ruling over this city, right? And these are the ziggurats. Ziggurats were the temples that they used to build for the gods. And the gods were supposed to live in the top part of these temples. So the highest the temple would be, then this would bring men closer to the gods because it would be closer to the skies. Now, after a big period, this is, I don't remember his name, Marduk. His name is Marduk, and he was the most important god in one of the cities of Mesopotamia. This is the city of Babylon. And if you see here, the ziggurat of Marduk was supposed to be the highest ziggurat of all times. And they tried actually, back in those days, to build the biggest ziggurat. And this is actually the origin of the biblical history of the Tower of Babel. The Tower of Babel is actually the huge ziggurat of Babylon in which Marduk was supposed to live. And according to the legend, Marduk himself commissioned the other gods to build Babylon. So these are societies living in Mesopotamia, right? Now, what is the state? Because we have seen very clearly what happens with the city and with all of its population, but now we need to pay attention to the state. So, what is a state really? Well, we're going to see two definitions. The first one that we're going to be seeing is the one coming from Max Weber. And Max Weber was a sociologist of the 20th century, so very few years ago. And he gave us the following definition of a state. In order to call an organization a way in which a society is organizing itself as a state, it needs to accomplish the following four characteristics. First, stable institutions. This means that the state is not going to just disappear. There needs to be institutions that will maintain the state even if there are troubles. If you don't have that, perhaps you're not talking about the state. You need centralized power. This is very important. If you remember, in tribes, you do not have a centralized authority. Everybody does basically what they want, and it is okay. Only in states and chiefdoms, like as you go closer to the state in the way of organization, you are going to have central authorities. But what Max Weber is going to be saying that is the most important characteristic of the state is the monopoly over legitimate violence. This means that only the state is able to use violence in a legal way. If you or if I use violence, it is not going to be legal. The only one who can use the violence in a legal way is the state. And finally, this is like an extra characteristic that Max Weber is stating. You have a bureaucracy implied in all of this. This means, as we saw, you have people devoted to the administration, to the management of the state. And it is a special social class. Like usually when we talk about social classes, you imagine poor people and rich people, right? The low classes and the high classes. But there is a very special social class that is made out of bureaucrats. Bureaucracy is a social class on its own. They are the people that work for the state, that work for the government. And it is a social class on its own. So what is the point here? Well, that Mesopotamia was the first place where we ever saw stable institutions. When we first saw in history that power got centralized and that they were going to be ruled by one guy, that violence wasn't just exercised everywhere, that only the state had the power to exercise violence, and that there was a particular social class devoted to the management of the state. This was the first time in history in which all of these four characteristics came together in one society. And that was Mesopotamia. And that was the first state with the first cities of history. Now, I am going to give you time, boys, to pause this video, to think about it, to think if you are understanding, if you want to repeat something or whatever. And we will continue in a few seconds. Okay, so I trust that you have already paused the video and so on, because now we're going to enter a second definition of state. And this was actually the first definition of state in history. However, what we're going to be doing now is apply it to study a different society. Now we're going to get away of Mesopotamia and we're going to study Egypt. But we still have the same problem. We still want to research the same question. What is the state and how is the state related to these ancient cultures? So in order to study Egypt, I am going to use another definition. I am going to use the first definition that this guy called Machiavelli thought originally in the 16th century. So Machiavelli wrote this book called The Prince. And in this book, he's explaining how does a state work. So it is very interesting because Machiavelli is basically thinking that the state is absolutely related to the exercise of power. The state is all about the exercise of power in order to rule. To rule what? Well, population and territory. But This exercise of power in the work of Machiavelli is going to be exercised much beyond morals and religion. If in order to exercise the power of the state, you need to do something that goes against morality, it doesn't matter, you should do it. If you have to do something that goes against religion, if you are the head of a state, according to Machiavelli, then by all means do it. The state is more important than that. So it is really interesting because if the state is basically the exercise of power in order to rule, then who is the only one who is able to exercise this power? Well, the prince himself, right? So this is going to cause in the work of Machiavelli that he's going to make this assimilation. The prince is the state. So if we think that the prince is the state, then we can think of the following sentences. If the prince is weak, this means if the ruler, if the king or the president, whatever, if the prince is weak, then the state is going to be weak. Why? Because the prince is the state. If you have a weak leader, then you are weak. If you have a strong leader, then you are strong. The prince is the state. And the other way around. If the prince is strong, if you have a strong leader, then your state, your country is going to be strong. Why? Because the prince is the state. So there is this phrase that is very famous. Everybody says that it is from Machiavelli, but it is not. However, it expresses really well what Machiavelli is trying to say. And the phrase says as follows: the end justifies the means. What is the end? Well, the end is like a goal, something that you want to achieve. And in this case, well, the goal is to keep the state together, to make it grow and to make it strong. So if that is your goal, according to Machiavelli, if your goal is the state, then everything is justified. Everything that you do or that you don't do, it is justified if you are doing it in the name of the state. And what are the means? Well, absolutely whatever you need to do in order to keep the state together, to make it grow and to make it strong. It doesn't matter what you have to do. Your goal is to keep the state strong. This phrase actually is from Machiavelli. This one comes in his book. And it says, "It is better to be feared than to be loved, because love will end and they will hate you. But fear never ends, and no one will dare to move against you if they fear you." So he's trying to talk to a king, right? And he's telling this king, look, my king, if you want to be very nice to your people and make them love you, that is going to work for you. They are going to obey you because they like you. But one day, you are going to do something that they will not like. And that day, they are going to stop loving you. And they are going to start hating you. And they will not obey you anymore. Why? Because they were only obeying you because they liked you. And if they don't like you anymore, then they won't obey. However, if instead of being nice to them, you give them fear, you fill them with fear of your power, then they will never dare to act against you. Why? Because they fear you. Fear never ends, however love does. If you see, this is a very dark way of thinking, but he was really smart, right? He was really seeing behind things. He was like, I am not going to talk pretty, I am going to talk real, right? So he was very, very good, very intelligent, however, very dark of thought. So now, what we want to do is to apply this definition of Machiavelli to the study of Egypt. So how do we do that? Well, basically, boys and girls, please write this down in your notebook. This is what I will need you to include in your exam. These periods, the Hesps, the Dynasty 0, the Dynasty 1, the Dynasty 2, the Dynasty 4, and the Dynasty 5. And I am going to tell you why. because very particular things are happening during these periods of Egyptian history. So this is what I need you to answer in your exam, okay? So, well, here I present you the continent of Africa. Of course, over here you have the Mediterranean Sea. This is Italy. Uh, this is Greece over here. Over here you have Constantinople. Well, one day you had it there. And this is present day Egypt. But of course, back in those days, Egypt was quite bigger because Egypt was basically the whole Nile River. So, well, yes, this is the Nile River. I introduce it to you. And what is really interesting is that this upper part here is called the Lower Egypt. And this part down here is called the Upper Egypt. Why? Because this part of the Nile River and of Egypt was in highlands. That is why it is the Upper Egypt, because it is in a high territory. And this part of Egypt was basically at the sea level, so it is in the lowlands, right? So this is why this is the Lower Egypt. Now, let's go to study the Hesps. What are the Hesps? These are the first thing that you need to talk about in your exam. The Hesps are territorial divisions based on productivity. And what is really special here is that each HESP has a leader. So as we saw in class, all of these are HESPs. So this is how the territory of Egypt is being divided, and they are dividing it in this way because all of these areas have water, have silt, so they can produce, right? It is based on productivity. However, what is really interesting is that each of these HESPs has a leader. So what is the first thing to notice here? That the first part of Egyptian history, we do not have a state. Why don't we have a state? Because as you can see here, there are a lot of leaders. Every HESP has a leader. So if you remember with Max Weber, we said that the state implies centralized authority. And in here, I don't have centralized authority. I have a lot of leaders. Really a lot of leaders. So this is not a state. When did the Egyptian state started? Well, in the Zero Dynasty. Why? Because in the Zero Dynasty, all those Hesps were controlled by two kings. One king up here that wore this red crown, and one king down here that used to wear this white crown. Also, something really interesting is that the representative animal of the Lower Egypt is the snake, and of the Upper Egypt is the vulture. And also that the main god of the Lower Egypt is Set, and of the Upper Egypt it's Horus. And if you remember what we said in classes, this is related to our topic. This is important too. So now, during the Zero Dynasty, we were able to see this change. Now we have a state. Why? Because now we have two leaders, two pharaohs that are going to be controlling the Hesps. So this means that they are strong men, right? They are stronger than all the other leaders, and that is why they can control all the other leaders. But when does the first dynasty start? Well, it starts with King Menes. And what King Menes is going to do, he was a king of the Upper Egypt, and he's going to conquer the Lower Egypt. So he's going to use violence, right, in order to control this part of the territory. And you will be able to see that he's the king, well, because he's wearing both of the crowns together. And if you pay attention here, he also has the two animals in his crown. So he's wearing these first two elements together, the snake and the vulture, and the red and the white crown. But there is something missing, right? Right over here, there is something missing. So what is going to happen? Well, by the end of the first dynasty, everything that Menes was achieving got into trouble. The two Egypts started to spread apart again, and a change of leadership was required. When you change a dynasty, what you are changing is the family that is going to rule. So far in the first dynasty, everyone that was ruling were the sons and the grandsons and the great grandsons of Menes, right? They were a dynasty. But once they were not able to keep Egypt happy and together, then a new family had to come into reign. And that started the second dynasty. And the guy that became the king was called Hotep and this name is very special because it means the two powers are in peace. And if you pay attention to the drawing that I included here, you're going to be able to see both Horus, that was the god of the Upper Egypt, and Set, that was the god of the Lower Egypt, and they are together, right? If you see, they are tying a knot together. They are making this work together. And that is what the name of this pharaoh of the second dynasty, the first pharaoh of the second dynasty, is going to mean. That these two gods are in peace. Why? Because what he's meaning is that the two Egypts are going to be together now. But what is really interesting here is that so far what we have seen is that the state is going to remain together through the use of violence. But if you remember, one of the phrases that we were analyzing was, the ends justify the means. And in here, what we can see is that Hotep is not using violence as the means to get his end, to get his goal. What he's using is religion. What he's using is the things that these two kingdoms have in common, and that is what they believe, and he's using those beliefs in order to unite them in one kingdom. So that is very smart, and it was really, really useful. Why? Because throughout the second and third dynasties, Egypt was going great. Actually, if you see here, I didn't even include the third dynasty. Why? Because everything was nice and dandy. Everything was working perfectly well. However, by the time we reach the fourth dynasty, something very special is going to happen. And this is going to be the period in the history of Egypt in which the state is going to be the most powerful of, well, all Egyptian history. And how do we know this? Well, because this was the period in which the great pyramids were built. This was a period in which these great constructions were made. And just imagine, in order to build these huge things, what do you require? Well, you really require a very strong leader. You require centralized power. You require stable institutions. You require to use fear. You require to use religion. You require to use anything at all in order to be able to exercise the power to rule of your population. Because you need your population to build these things. You are not going to build them, right? If you are the president, you are not going to build the highway. You are going to tell someone to build the highway. And that requires a lot of power. Imagine making these huge constructions. This means that the state was at its most powerful moment of history. However, by the end of the fourth dynasty, we can see how Egypt lost control again. Why? Because by the beginning of the fifth dynasty, then the local powers are going to be winning power again. The two kingdoms are going to be dividing. The Hesps are going to be really powerful again. So we are going to be seeing that in the fifth dynasty and by the end of the fourth dynasty, the leaders were weak leaders. Why? Because the state was not in one piece. They were not able to keep the state in one piece. So they failed in their mission as princes. They were weak princes. And in the first dynasty, in the second dynasty, in the fourth dynasty, we can see very strong leaders, leaders that were able to do whatever was required in order to keep the state together. So that is precisely the idea that Machiavelli was expressing, right? So this is what you have to do, boys. You need to write a paragraph explaining how we can replace the idea of civilization using the case of Mesopotamia, and you need to be able to explain the development of the Egyptian state, paying attention to these stages here, which are the Hesps, the Dynasty 0, the Dynasty 1, the Dynasty 2, 4, and 5. You need to explain them in your exam using the definitions of state both of Machiavelli and, if you want, also of Max Weber. I need you to use Machiavelli here, but if you want to help yourselves by using Max Weber, then it is okay. Okay, boys and girls, please study very, very hard and remember everything that we saw in class. I am sure that you will do great, and see you.